The wind in Chicago didn't just blow, it bit. It was a relentless, icy predator that swept off Lake Michigan, funneling through the canyons of skyscrapers in the Loop, searching for any gap in a coat or a spirit. For Sarah Miller, the wind was an enemy she couldn't outrun. At 28, Sarah's life had been stripped down to the essentials. A heavy, stained parka found in a donation bin, a backpack containing their birth certificates and a single change of clothes, and the small, shivering hand of her 5-year-old son, Leo. They stood huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed deli, just 2 blocks away from the towering obsidian monolith known as the Sterling Financial Plaza. "Are we going to the big house today, Mummy?" Leo asked, his voice muffled by a threadbare scarf. His eyes, however, remained bright, an unsettling, observant blue that seemed to see through the grime of their situation. "Not a house, Leo. An office," Sarah whispered, rubbing his arms to keep the circulation moving. "And remember the deal. You stay in the hidden corner of the supply closet. No noise, no singing. If they see you, Mommy loses the job before she even starts." Sarah had lied on her application. She had used the address of a halfway house she had stayed at for exactly 3 nights before it became too dangerous to remain. The cleaning agency, desperate for overnight staff who wouldn't complain about the grueling hours, hadn't checked her references too closely. Tonight was her first shift as a floater janitor. While Sarah saw a battle for survival, the man on the 42nd floor saw only numbers. Elias Thorne, the chief financial officer of Sterling Financial, sat behind a desk, carved from a single slab of black walnut. At 35, he was known in the press as the Ice King of the Midwest. He was lean, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Sarah would earn in 3 years. To Elias, people were variables. If they were efficient, they stayed. If they were redundant, they were deleted. He lived his life by a rigorous, sterile logic. His apartment was a monochrome museum of minimalism. His social life was a series of strategic networking events. He had reached the pinnacle of the financial world by cauterizing his emotions after a childhood spent watching his own father lose everything to sentimental investments. Elias looked at his watch. 9 Kasmamat p.m. The cleaning crews would be arriving soon. He usually ignored them, treating the rhythmic shush of vacuums as white noise for his late-night projections. But tonight, he felt a strange, uncharacteristic restlessness. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city. From this height, the people below looked like ants. He found comfort in that. Ants were predictable. They followed trails. They didn't have stories. Down in the basement, Sarah was being handed a heavy cart laden with industrial chemicals and grey rags. The supervisor, a man named Miller who smelled of stale cigarettes, didn't look her in the eye. "Floor 40 to 45. High-profile executive suites. If you see a scrap of paper on a desk, you leave it. If you see a computer on, you don't touch it. You're a ghost, Miller, understand? Ghosts don't leave footprints, and they don't make sounds." Sarah nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had managed to sneak Leo into the building inside a large, empty laundry bin she'd intercepted near the loading dock. He was now tucked away in a small, cramped maintenance nook on the 42nd floor, behind a stack of air filters. She had given him his last juice box and a picture book with half its pages missing. "I'll be right outside the door, Leo," she had whispered, kissing his forehead. Now pushing the heavy cart onto the elevator, Sarah felt the ascent in her stomach. The doors opened to the 42nd floor, a world of marble floors, hushed air conditioning, and the scent of expensive cologne and old money. It was a fortress of glass and steel, and she was the intruder meant to polish its edges. She began to scrub. Her back ached almost immediately, a dull throb reminding her of the nights spent sleeping on plastic chairs or thin mats. She moved with frantic efficiency, desperate to prove her worth. She emptied trash cans filled with memos about billions of dollars, her mind calculating how many meals a single % of that money could buy for Leo. As she reached the end of the hallway, she saw a sliver of light spilling from the final office. The CFO's office. She hesitated. The supervisor said he usually stayed late. She gripped the handle of her mop, her knuckles white. She just needed to get in, empty the bin, and get out. She didn't know that inside that office, The Ice King was about to have his first encounter not with her, but with the small, curious boy who had grown tired of waiting in the dark and had decided to follow the sound of a distant, ticking clock. Elias Thorne didn't believe in distractions. His office was a vacuum of productivity. However, the rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock, the only heirloom he possessed, usually provided a meditative backdrop. Tonight, the rhythm was off. There was a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of a heavy velvet curtain rustling. Elias turned from the window. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice like sliding stones. From behind the long, midnight blue drapes near the bookcase, a small head peeked out. Leo didn't look afraid, he looked fascinated. He stepped out fully, his oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder, his face smudged with a bit of dust from the maintenance nook. "Your clock is loud," Leo said simply, pointing at the mahogany timepiece. "It sounds like a heart." Elias froze. He was a man who handled hostile takeovers and billion-dollar devaluations without blinking, but he had no protocol for a child in his inner sanctum at 10 p.m. "How did you get in here? Where are your parents?" Leo walked closer, his eyes locked on a silver Newton's cradle on Elias's desk. "Mommy is working. She's a ghost." Elias frowned, his predatory instincts giving way to confusion. "A ghost?" "Mr. Miller said she has to be a ghost so we can stay," Leo explained, reaching out a tentative finger to touch one of the silver spheres. He looked up at Elias. "Are you the king of this castle?" Elias sat back in his chair, mesmerized by the boy's lack of fear. "I'm the CFO, Leo. It's not a castle, it's a firm." "You look sad," Leo remarked, his blunt honesty cutting through Elias's professional armor. "My mummy says when people are mean and quiet, it's because their hearts are cold and need a blanket." Before Elias could respond, before he could call security or demand an explanation, the heavy glass door swung open. Sarah stood there, her face draining of all color. She dropped her spray bottle, the blue liquid pooling on the pristine marble. "Leo!" she gasped, her voice a frantic whisper. She rushed forward, grabbing her son and pulling him behind her. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman who had just lost her last lifeline. "Sir, please, I'm so sorry. He got out of the closet. Please don't call the police. I'll leave. We'll leave right now." Elias looked at the woman. She was thin, her clothes were worn, but her posture was that of a lioness protecting a cub. He looked at the spilled cleaning fluid and then back at the boy, who was waving a small, shy hand at him from behind Sarah's legs. Something shifted in Elias. It wasn't kindness, not yet, but a clinical curiosity. "The closet?" he asked. "You've been keeping a child in a supply closet." "I had no choice," Sarah whispered, tears blurring her vision. "It's 10 degrees outside. We have nowhere else to go." Elias looked at his polished desk, then at the trembling woman. For the first time in years, the numbers didn't add up. Logic dictated he fire her. But the boy's words, "Hearts need a blanket," echoed in the sterile air. "Clean up the spill," Elias said, his voice regaining its cold edge though it lacked its usual bite. "And put the boy in the leather armchair. If he stays in the closet, he'll suffocate. I have work to finish." The following week was an exercise in silent tension. Sarah expected to be fired every time she punched her time card, but the call never came. Instead, a new routine formed. Every night at 9:30 p.m., Sarah would arrive on the 42nd floor. And every night, the door to the CFO's office was left unlocked. Elias Thorne would be there, buried in spreadsheets, but a small space on the corner of his massive mahogany table would be cleared. Leo would sit in the oversized leather chair, swinging his legs. Sarah would clean the glass walls, her eyes constantly darting to the office. She saw the strangest sight, the most feared man in Chicago's financial sector sharing his expensive artisanal crackers with a homeless 5-year-old. "What's this number?" Leo asked one night, pointing at a glowing monitor. "That is a projected loss," Elias said, not looking up. "It means someone made a mistake." "Is it a big mistake?" $8 million worth, Leo whistled, a sound he'd learned from the men at the shelter. "You should give them a hug. Maybe they were just tired." Elias actually paused. He looked at the boy, then at the screen. "In this building, Leo, we don't hug. We terminate." "That's a scary word," Leo whispered. "Like eviction?" The word hit Elias like a physical blow. He looked at Sarah through the glass. She was scrubbing a baseboard, her movements weary but determined. He realized he didn't even know her last name, only that she was Miller on the roster. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah entered the office to retrieve Leo. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely audible. "You don't know what this means to us. The heat in here, it's the only time he's truly warm." Elias didn't look up from his papers. It's more efficient this way. He's less likely to wander into the hallways and trigger the motion sensors if he's in here. "Of course," Sarah said, though she saw the small pile of coloring books on the credenza that hadn't been there yesterday. "Good night, sir." After they left, Elias stood by the window. He watched the tiny figures emerge from the building's side entrance and disappear into the dark, snowy mouth of the subway station. He felt a phantom warmth on his hand where Leo had touched him to say goodbye. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the board of directors. Confirmation on the budget cuts. The janitorial staff reduction is overdue. Elias looked at the message for a long time. His thumb hovered over the approve button. If he clicked it, Sarah would be out on the street by Monday. The numbers demanded it. The profit margins required it. But for the first time in his career, the Ice King felt a crack in his frost. He deleted the draft. The Chicago winter grew more vicious. A polar vortex settled over the city, turning the streets into a graveyard of ice. On Tuesday, Sarah didn't show up for her shift. Elias sat in his office, his eyes repeatedly drifting to the empty leather chair. He told himself he was annoyed because the trash hadn't been emptied. He told himself his routine was being disrupted. By 11:00 p.m. he called the cleaning supervisor. "Where is Miller?" Elias snapped. "Fired her, Mr. Thorne," the supervisor chuckled. "She missed 2 shifts, no call, no show, you know the rules. Reliability is everything." Elias felt a surge of cold fury that had nothing to do with the weather. "Where does she live?" "Live? Sir, she's a floater, probably a shelter. I have an address on file, but it's a mission down on Van Buren." "Why do you care?" Elias hung up without answering. He grabbed his cashmere overcoat and headed for the elevator. The Van Buren mission was a place of despair. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, bleach, and old soup. Elias, in his 3-piece suit, looked like an alien among the rows of metal cots. He found them in a corner, tucked away from the main walkway. Leo was flushed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah was sitting on the floor beside him, pressing a damp grey rag to his forehead. She looked up when she saw Elias's polished shoes, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, "what are you doing here?" "He's burning up, Sarah," Elias said, actually kneeling on the dirty linoleum. He touched Leo's forehead. The heat was terrifying. "The clinic is closed," Sarah sobbed, her composure finally breaking. "I don't have insurance. They told me to wait until morning." "I lost the job, Elias. I lost everything." Elias didn't hesitate. He picked the boy up, wrapping him in his own $5,000 coat. "We're leaving. Now." "Where?" "To a doctor who doesn't ask for insurance cards before he asks for symptoms," Elias said. As he carried the child out of the shelter, Sarah following in a daze, the onlookers stared. The Ice King was carrying a shivering, homeless boy like he was the most precious cargo in the world. For Elias, the world of spreadsheets had vanished. There was only the weight of the child in his arms and the desperate need to fix a variable that wasn't a number. The private clinic was discreet and expensive. By 3:00 a.m., Leo was hooked to an IV drip, diagnosed with severe pneumonia and exhaustion. Elias sat in the waiting room, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his tie discarded. Sarah sat opposite him, clutching a paper cup of bitter coffee. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "We're nothing to you." Elias looked at his hands. "My father was a proud man, Sarah. He owned a small print shop. When the economy turned, he lost it all. We lived in our car for 6 months. He used to tell me that the world only respects those who have and crushes those who don't." He paused. "I decided I would never be crushed, but I forgot that you can be crushed from the inside, too." He looked at her, seeing her not as a janitor, but as a person who had fought a war every single day just to keep her son alive. "You aren't nothing," You're the strongest person I've met in this city." When Leo was stable enough to be moved, Elias didn't send them back to the shelter. He took them to his penthouse. The apartment was cold and white, but Sarah saw it as a palace. Leo was tucked into a guest bed with silk sheets, and Sarah was given the first hot shower she'd had in months. The next morning, Leo woke up to the smell of real bacon and toasted bread. He sat up, looking around the minimalist room. "Mommy, is this the castle?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hair damp and clean. "It's Mr. Thorne's home, Leo. We're just staying until you're better." Elias appeared in the doorway holding a tablet. "Actually," he said, his voice regaining some of its professional clip, though his eyes were softer, "I've been looking at the company's internal structure. We have a desperate need for a facilities liaison, someone who understands the building from the ground up. It's a salaried position. It comes with health benefits and a housing stipend." Sarah stood up, her breath catching. "Elias, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," he said. "The board thinks I'm streamlining, but I'm actually investing in human capital." Leo jumped out of bed, still a bit weak but grinning. He ran to Elias and hugged his knees. "I knew you were a king," he whispered. Elias Thorne, the man who hadn't hugged anyone in 15 years, tentatively placed a hand on the boy's head. "I'm just a CFO, Leo, but I think I'm learning how to be a person again." Life began to settle into a new, hopeful rhythm. Sarah excelled in her new role. She was natural, efficient, and well-liked by the staff who had previously looked through her. She and Leo moved into a modest but bright apartment in Lincoln Park, funded by her new salary. Elias remained their silent guardian, though he kept a professional distance at the office. However, the corporate world of Sterling Financial was not built on kindness. Marcus Vane, the chief operating officer, and Elias's primary rival, had been watching. Marcus was a man who thrived on leverage. He had noticed the CFO's sudden change in demeanor, the way he stayed late not to work, but to wait for the facilities liaison to finish her rounds. He had noticed the child who occasionally visited the executive floor. "You're getting soft, Elias," Marcus said, leaning against the doorframe of Elias's office one Tuesday afternoon. "The board is asking questions about this new position you created. Facilities liaison? Sounds like a charity case to me." Elias didn't look up from his screen. "The department is running 15% more efficiently, Marcus. The numbers speak for themselves." "Do they?" Marcus tossed a folder onto Elias's desk. It contained Sarah's original falsified application. She lied on her background check. She used a fake address. She has a history of vagrancy. If the press gets wind that the Ice King is playing house with a homeless woman on the company dime, the stock will tank. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Not for his career, but for Sarah. She was desperate, Marcus. Anyone would have done the same. "Desperation is a liability," Marcus sneered. "Fire her by Friday, or I take this to the board. And I'll make sure the story includes how you used your position to provide favors to a subordinate. It won't just be her career that ends, Elias. It'll be yours." Elias watched Marcus walk away, the man's laughter echoing in the hall. For the first time, Elias felt the walls of his glass fortress closing in. He had spent his life building this empire, but now the empire was threatening the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. That evening, the atmosphere in the executive suite was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone from the cooling computers and the impending sense of a storm. Sarah noticed it the moment she stepped off the elevator. Usually the floor had a quiet hum of prestige, but tonight it felt like a tomb. She walked toward the corner office, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, to find Elias Thorne sitting in total darkness. The only light came from the sprawling Chicago skyline outside, the orange and white lights of the city reflecting in his eyes like cold embers. "Elias, what's wrong?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with an intuitive fear. She didn't call him Mr. Thorne anymore when they were alone. The distance between them had been bridged by shared crackers and a child's laughter. But tonight, the distance felt vast again. He turned to her, his face a mask of profound exhaustion. The shadows under his eyes were deep, and he had loosened his tie, a rare sign of disarray for the Ice King. "Marcus Vane found out about your original application, Sarah. He didn't just find it, he dissected it. He's going to use the falsified address and your history of homelessness to frame this as a massive breach of security and corporate ethics. He's going to use it to sink us both." Sarah felt the familiar, sickening weight of panic. It was a physical sensation, like falling through ice. The old life, the nights spent shivering on frozen sidewalks, the humiliation of grey donation rags, the constant gnawing fear of being found out by society, was clawing at her heels again. She looked at her clean hands and then at the door. "I'll resign," she said quickly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'll leave tonight. I can take Leo and go to another city, maybe further south where it's warmer. If I'm gone, he has no leverage. He has nothing on you. You can tell the board you discovered the fraud and handled it. You can keep your life, Elias." "No," Elias said, standing up with a sudden, sharp energy. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. "If you leave, he wins. If you leave, I go back to being a man who lives in a museum of dead things. I spent years building this fortress of glass and steel to keep the world out, because I was afraid of being poor again. I thought that by becoming cold, I became untouchable." "But your career, everything you worked for," she cried, her eyes filling with tears. "You're the CFO of one of the biggest firms in the country. You can't throw that away for a janitor you found in a supply closet." Elias walked over to the grandfather clock, the only piece of furniture that felt human in the room. He touched the dark, polished wood gently. "My father was a good man, Sarah. He was kind, he was generous, and he lost his business because he trusted people during a bad time. I watched him break. I spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of him. I thought being hard meant being safe, but I realized something when I saw you with Leo at that shelter. You were losing everything, your job, your health, your dignity, and yet you were still the best person I'd ever met. You didn't let the cold turn you into stone." He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I'm not letting you go back to the streets. I'm not letting Marcus use your struggle as a weapon. But we have to play this differently. We can't hide in the shadows anymore. We have to step into the light even if it burns." "What are you going to do?" she whispered. "I'm going to do something no one at Sterling Financial ever expects." Elias smiled, a genuine, dangerous smile that didn't reach for safety but for justice. "I'm going to tell the truth, all of it. I'm going to show them that our greatest security breach was actually our greatest success." The plan was a massive gamble. Elias spent the entire night fueled by black coffee and a new sense of purpose. He didn't build a spreadsheet of profits, he built a narrative. He prepared a presentation that detailed the efficiency of the cleaning crews, the reduction in turnover, and a new proposal for a social responsibility initiative. He was going to frame Sarah's story not as a scandal, but as a pilot program for second-chance employment. He knew Marcus would strike with venom at the Friday morning meeting, but for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne wasn't afraid of the fall. He was looking forward to the fight. The boardroom was a temple of chrome, leather, and silent judgment. Located on the 50th floor, it offered a godlike view of the city, a view that usually made the 12 members of the board feel invincible. Today, the air was thick with a different kind of electricity. They sat in high-back chairs, their faces unreadable as Marcus Vane stood at the head of the table. He wore a sharp charcoal suit and a smug, predatory grin that suggested he had already tasted victory. "Before we begin the quarterly fiscal review," Marcus announced, his voice echoing with practiced authority, "I have a grave matter of ethics and corporate security to bring to your attention. It seems our esteemed CFO has been using company resources to harbor a woman of questionable background. I have evidence of systematic fraud, falsified documents, and a serious lapse in executive judgment that threatens the reputation of Sterling Financial." With a theatrical flourish, he threw a thick stack of folders onto the table. They slid across the polished wood like a slap to the face. The board members began to murmur, their brows furrowing as they flipped through Sarah's old records and the photos Marcus's private investigator had taken of the mission on Van Buren. Elias Thorne stood up. He didn't look like a man under fire. He didn't look like the Ice King who spoke only in percentages. He looked like a man who had finally found his footing on solid ground. "Marcus is correct about the facts, though his interpretation is predictably narrow," Elias said. his voice projecting through the room with a calm power that silenced the murmurs. I did hire Sarah Miller under unconventional circumstances. I bypassed the standard background checks, and I did so because our traditional hiring metrics are failing us. We hire for pedigrees and we get mediocrity. I hired for survival and I got excellence. He signaled the technician at the back of the room, and a video began to play on the massive LED screens. It wasn't a video of Sarah's past, it was a data-driven montage of her present. It showed the 40% increase in janitorial efficiency, the restructured supply routes she had designed that saved the company $200,000 in waste, and interviews with lower-level staff who felt, for the first time, that the executive floor actually cared about their existence. Sarah Miller was homeless, Elias said, leaning forward and looking each board member in the eye, challenging their prejudices. She lied on that application to save her son's life. She lied because a system that demands a permanent address from someone sleeping on a subway grate is a system designed to keep people down. But in the 3 months she has been here, she has outperformed every qualified predecessor we've ever had. She represents a demographic this board has ignored for decades, the resilient, the ones who don't break when the wind bites. Marcus went a violent shade of red, his composure fracturing. This is a pathetic smokescreen. You're not talking about corporate strategy, Elias. You're talking about a charity case. You're just trying to cover for your mistress because you got caught playing savior. She is not my mistress, Elias said firmly, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register. She is a colleague. She is a mother. And if you had spent half as much time looking at her performance as you did digging through her trash to find dirt, Marcus, you'd see she's the best investment this company has made this year. I am officially proposing the Thorne Miller Initiative, a permanent program dedicated to hiring, training and housing high-potential individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. I am putting my own salary on the line to fund the first year. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. The board members looked at each other, the raw data of Sarah's success clashing with Marcus's vitriol. Finally, the oldest member of the board, Evelyn Reed, a woman who had survived 3 market crashes and was known for her ruthlessness, spoke up. Her voice was thin but sharp. "And the child, Elias? I heard there was a child involved in this security breach." As if on cue, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room opened. Sarah stood there holding Leo's hand. She wasn't wearing a janitor's uniform. She was wearing a simple, professional navy dress Elias had helped her select. She looked terrified, her knuckles white as she gripped Leo's hand, but she stood tall. Leo, seeing Elias, broke into a wide, gap-toothed grin. He remembered his deal. No talking in the big office, so he just waved a small, shy hand. "This is the future we're investing in," Elias said, gesturing to the boy. "If we are a firm that prides itself on wealth management, but we can't protect the people who build our wealth from the ground up, then we aren't a firm. We're just a counting house for the heartless. Why are we even here, if not to build something that lasts beyond a fiscal quarter?" The board's decision wasn't unanimous, and the debate lasted for 4 grueling hours after Sarah and Leo were escorted out. But in the end, the numbers combined with the raw humanity of the presentation won. Marcus Vane was censured for his aggressive, non-sanctioned surveillance of employees and was eventually pushed into an early retirement. Elias's Thorne Miller Initiative was given a 6-month trial period. It was a victory, but a fragile one, a seedling planted in the middle of a Chicago winter. As they walked out of the Sterling Financial Plaza that afternoon, the sun was actually shining. It was that rare, blinding winter sun that turned the snow into diamonds, reflecting off the glass towers, in a way that felt warm for the first time in months. "You risked everything," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she leaned against a concrete planter. The adrenaline was finally fading, leaving her weak. "You could have lost your house, your reputation, your name. Why did you go that far for us?" Slakas looked at Leo, who was a few feet away, busy trying to catch a falling snowflake on his tongue, his laughter a bright silver sound against the roar of city traffic. "Because for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the numbers on a screen, Sarah. I cared about the people in the room. I realized that my father didn't lose because he was a good man. He lost because the world didn't have enough people like him to stand up for him. I decided it was time I stood up. He looked at her, his eyes soft. It's a much better way to live. I can breathe again. However, the transition to this new life wasn't a perfect, instant transition. In the weeks that followed, Sarah still felt the cold sting of whispers in the hallways. She saw the way some of the junior analysts looked at her, with a mix of pity and suspicion. She still suffered from imposter syndrome, that haunting feeling that at any moment someone would tap her on the shoulder and tell her it was all a dream, and she needed to pick up the mop again. One evening, as she was finishing her new reports in her own modest office on the 38th floor, Elias knocked on the doorframe. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket, and his sleeves were rolled up. "You don't have to stay this late anymore, Sarah. You're not a janitor, and you're not a ghost. You have a staff now. You can go home." "I know," she said, looking up from her computer, her eyes tired, "but I feel like if I stop moving, if I get too comfortable, the ground will just disappear again. I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop." Elias walked in and sat on the edge of her desk, a gesture of casual friendship that would have been impossible months ago. "The ground is solid, Sarah. I made sure of it. I've personally purchased the apartment building next to yours. I'm turning the entire first 3 floors into a permanent housing and training center for the foundation. It's not a shelter, it's a dormitory for the program, and I don't want you to just be an employee there." "What do you mean?" "I want you to run the entire foundation. I want you to be the director of human resilience. Who better? You know exactly what they need. You know the specific fear of the 2 a.m. cold. You can be the bridge between the boardroom and the street." Sarah looked at him, really looked at the man who had once been called the Ice King. The frost had completely melted, leaving behind a man who had found a purpose that no bank account could ever match. "You've changed so much, Elias. You're not the man I met in that dark office." "No," he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. "I just finally came home to the person I was always supposed to be. I'm finally awake." A year had passed, and the Chicago skyline remained as jagged and beautiful as ever. But for those who worked within the Sterling Financial Plaza, the soul of the building had undergone a profound shift. The Thorne Miller Foundation was no longer a trial program. It was a resounding national success, recently featured in the New York Times as a revolutionary model for corporate empathy and long-term investment in human capital. But the real change wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small, quiet moments that occupied the corners of the great glass fortress. It was Christmas Eve, and a soft, thick snow was falling over the loop, muffling the sound of the city. The office was mostly empty, the high-stress trading floors replaced by warm, golden holiday lights and a massive 20-foot spruce tree in the lobby, decorated with ornaments made by the children of the foundation's families. Elias, Sarah, and Leo stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, overlooking the lobby. They weren't there for a late-night merger or a crisis meeting. They were there to celebrate. Leo was 6 now, nearly 7. He was taller, his cheeks were a healthy rosy pink, and his eyes were still as bright and observant as the day he first snuck into the CFO's office. He was dressed in a small red wool sweater, and he no longer moved like a ghost. He ran across the marble floor with the confidence of a child who knew he belonged, his laughter echoing up to the vaulted ceiling. "Look, Elias, Mommy, look! The clock!" Leo shouted, pointing toward the center of the lobby. The vintage grandfather clock, the one that had once sat in Elias's lonely, dark office, had been moved to a place of honor in the main lobby. It was no longer a symbol of a ticking deadline or a dying legacy. It had been restored, its mahogany glowing under the Christmas lights. It ticked steadily and strongly, a heartbeat for the hundreds of people who had been given a second chance, a rhythmic reminder that time could be a healer rather than a thief. Elias reached out and took Sarah's hand. His grip was firm and warm, a silent promise that had been kept through every storm of the past year. It wasn't a calculated corporate gesture. It was the act of a man who had finally found something worth holding on to. "We did it," he whispered, watching Leo dance around the base of the clock. "We actually changed the algorithm." "We survived," Sarah corrected him, a playful but meaningful smile touching her lips. She looked around at the lobby, seeing a few other families from the program gathered near the tree, their faces full of a peace she recognized all too well. "More than that," Elias said, looking out through the giant glass walls at the city lights. "We thrived. We showed them that you don't have to be cold to be strong." As they walked out into the crisp, quiet Chicago night, they weren't heading toward a crowded mission or a sterile, empty penthouse. They were heading to a home they had built with bricks of trust and mortar of shared struggle, a place where the wind could howl all it wanted but could never bite, and where no one ever had to hide in a supply closet again. The Ice King had finally found his blanket, the homeless mom had found her fortress, and the boy who knew the truth first had changed the world, one steady tick of the clock at a time.